Well, good afternoon, everybody. I'm Tim Hassett-Sally, Regional Director at WCRI. I'm pleased to be introducing the next session, which is Economic Cycles and Workers' Compensation. And we've got two wonderful speakers, Dr. Len Herk and Dr. John Ruser. Dr. Len Herk is Executive Director and Senior Economist at NCCI and Focus Lead for Economic Research. Prior to joining NCCI in 2013, Len worked in New York at several investment funds, and prior to that, he taught economics as a faculty member at Florida State, Tulane, Johns Hopkins, and Columbia Universities. He has been published in the Journal of Economic Theory and the Rand Journal of Economics. Len holds a PhD in economics from the University of Virginia and an MS in computational finance from Carnegie Mellon University. Welcome, Dr. Herk. Dr. John Ruser is President and CEO of WCRI. Dr. Ruser previously held several executive positions in the United States government, including serving as Assistant Commissioner for Safety, Health, and Working Conditions at the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics. Earlier in his career, Dr. Ruser was a researcher and head of the BLS office that conducted research on employee compensation and working conditions in the U.S. He holds a PhD and MA degrees in economics from the University of Chicago and a BA in economics from Princeton University. Welcome, Dr. Ruser, and you're up first.
Thank you very much, Tim, and thank you all for being here. So I'm going to start out the presentation, and then Len's going to do all the really interesting stuff. So I really loved Mike Horrigan's presentation. He had a lot of information. There were about 2 or 3 takeaways that I had from it that I might use when I talk about data on injuries and illnesses. First of all, if you may recall that he talked about the differing cyclicality of different industries. So he showed the highly cyclical nature of employment and construction as compared to really the lack of cyclicality of the health sector. So that's sort of one takeaway, though I think Len's got some additional points about relationships between cyclicality and industries that I'll let him make. The other one was about the decline in manufacturing employment that we're all aware of and how it kind of leveled off and how it's been, manufacturing employment has been pretty flat since the recovery from the Great Recession. So that was one point. The other point that Mike made that I sort of want to make mention to is the relatively slow expansion, both of the expansion from 2001 to 2007, as well as the expansion from out of the Great Recession. And I think that has a bearing on some of the safety and health data that I'm going to be showing now. So why would we think that economic cycles would have any impact on workplace injury and illness rates and numbers and workers' compensation claiming? Well, there are a variety of theories that have gotten some support for why we might expect such an impact of, say, an economic recession on injury rates. First of all, certain sectors, as I just mentioned, are more cyclical than others, and some of those sectors, particularly construction, tend to be higher risk. So as employment drops more in a recession in a high-risk industry, it's going to shift the employment distribution towards safer industries. So overall, injury rates are going to drop. Also, one thing that we know is that during an economic downturn, less experienced workers are the first to be laid off. Data that I won't have time to show you shows that less experienced workers tend to have a higher injury rate. So the mix of workers will shift such that in a downturn, you'll have relatively safer workers. In an economic recession, the pace of work slows, and worker fatigue may drop, and also improving injury rates. And then there's potentially a reporting effect where workers are concerned that if they report a workplace injury during a recession, it may be harder to get their job back. So they may be less likely to report an injury and to file a workers' comp claim. So that's 4 different reasons why an economic cycle, an economic recession in particular, might affect injury rates. Separate from the effect on rates and sort of holding rates constant, the number of injuries and claims will also, of course, drop when there's a decline in employment. So in contrast, there's another theory out there that during a downturn, workers who are concerned that they may face the closure of their firm, may be at risk of layoff, may file a workers' compensation claim essentially as a substitute for unemployment insurance. So that's one instance where during an economic recession we might see an increase in the workers' comp claiming rate and the numbers. So both Len and I are going to be talking about the BLS workplace injury and illness data, and not about workers' compensation claiming rate. I don't believe you have any in there, Len. And so I think it's important to emphasize how closely the injury and illness data from the BLS track with NCCI's indemnity claiming rate index. And so sort of like what Mike did with some of his data, I set the claiming rate, NCCI workers' comp claiming rate, and US days away from work injury rate index at 100 for 1999, and then I tracked the changes over time. And as of 2015, both of these data series were at 52% of where they were in 1999, and they track remarkably closely. The point of this is that as we talk about changes in injury rates due to an economic recession or an expansion, we're really also talking about the impact on workers' compensation claiming. So in the recent past, and Mike had these on his slide too, as gray bars, we've seen two recessions. There was a relatively short and not so severe recession in 2000. The peak of the cycle was in March of 2001, and then there was a drop down in economic activity down to November of 2001. So that was one recession. And then, of course, we know about the Great Recession, where there was a peak in economic activity as of December of 2007, and a drop all the way down to June of 2009, and then a slow expansion ever since. So I'm going to start by looking at the BLS workplace fatality data. And one thing that's very clear is that from around 2006 to 2009, there was a pretty steep drop in the workplace fatality rate. This is for occupational injuries only. So in the time series, you can see that up until about 2001, there was a gradual decline in the fatality rate, and then there was kind of a leveling off during the expansion that followed 2001. But then the fatality rate dropped substantially during the recession, and then since then, it's been completely flat. And so it's actually kind of interesting that the fatality rate would be flat during a period of economic expansion, because I've given you some theories about why you might expect that during an expansion, the injury rate would actually go up. So perhaps what's going on here is there's been a sort of a general decline in fatality rates from improvements in safety, and in this latest period, they're sort of being offset by the effect of the economic expansion, which albeit is slow. So when you flip to fatality counts, you see, again, a very dramatic drop in the fatality count, the number of fatalities of about 800, or I think it's about 19%. And then we've seen a slow increase in the number of fatalities in the country since 2009. And we're sort of up where we haven't been since the early 2000s. So again, the Great Recession led to a big drop in fatality rates as the number of employed dropped, and then there's been a slow rise in the fatality rates as folks have been coming back to work. But as Mike pointed out, the different sectors show different kinds of cyclicality. So the blue line is construction. And you can see that sort of up until about 2006, there was a general growth in the number of fatalities as construction employment ramped up. Then there was a severe recession in the construction industry, and we saw a big drop in the number of fatalities. And since about 2010, 2011, there's been a gradual increase again in the number of fatalities. Manufacturing shows kind of a different pattern. Mike showed kind of a drop in employment in manufacturing through the 90s up through the 2000s, and that's sort of the same trend that we see in the fatality numbers, where it dropped from 789 around 1994 and dropping down to 319 as of 2009. And then the manufacturing fatality number has been fairly flat since. So what I take from this is that the cyclicality that we saw in the fatality rates and counts overall are driven by certain sectors, particularly the construction sector. So in contrast, if you look at the rate of non-fatal cases with days away from work, and this is the rate per 100 full-time equivalent workers, there was a steady drop in that rate all the way from 1988 all the way down to 2009, just a complete steady drop. And since then, that non-fatal rate has completely leveled off during the most recent expansion. So I'm going to say the same sort of story that I said for fatalities. We have in the non-fatal data, we've had an improvements in safety. I'm going to interpret that way. There are others who think it's not only about safety, but reporting. But we see improvements in safety that have led to sharp declines in the non-fatal rate. And we had a leveling off as economic expansion has kind of like pulled up the non-fatal rate, if you will. When it comes to numbers of non-fatal injuries, these are in thousands, you kind of see some larger drops in the numbers of non-fatal cases during the two latest recessions. And again, a very flat profile during the most recent long economic expansion. Again, perhaps this push and pull of a gradual decline in general from safety versus kind of a pulling upward of the counts due to the growth of the economy. So sort of the same story for construction, a very sharp decline in the non-fatal injury rate for construction all the way up to the time when that industry started to recover, and then a fairly flat profile since. Again, when you look at the counts around the Great Recession, a very sharp drop, about a 50% drop in the number of non-fatal cases with days away from work. And then since then, the profile has been relatively flat. So in conclusion, and I'm going to pass things over to Len then, we're seeing that the impact of the Great Recession on rates was much more apparent for fatalities than it was for non-fatal cases in aggregate. The fatality counts show big drops, especially for construction. Non-fatal counts in aggregate show little impact of the Great Recession, though it's apparent in certain sectors, particularly in construction. What's also really interesting is the current expansion is witnessing flat fatality rate trends as well as a very modest decline in the non-fatal rate. But during this most recent expansion, something that folks have noted, the fatality counts have gone up, especially in construction, while the non-fatal case count has been remarkably flat. So I've been looking at these trends from sort of a very broad standpoint. Len's going to come up here now, and he's going to put a microscope onto some of the trends, both in the injuries and in employment. So.
Thank you, John. Good afternoon, Boston. I'm going to look at, maybe I should click forward to my title slide because there. I'm going to talk about employment fluctuations and workers' compensation. John talked about fatalities specifically. I'm going to enlarge the focus to talk about injuries more generally. And I'm going to talk about employment fluctuations. I'm going to talk about recessions, but there's a method to the madness here, and I'm going to generalize the idea. Now, let me start by benchmarking effects of recessions and employment fluctuations on injuries. What I'm not talking about is the first order effect, which is if you have a recession, that means a reduction in employment, that means fewer workers, that means fewer workers' compensation claims, that means less premium. This is what I'll call the first order effect. And it's very material, it's no joke. And as John mentioned, it can be very severe in some more cyclical sectors like construction and manufacturing, as we'll see. In other sectors like education and healthcare, it's practically non-existent. Now that's the big effect. What I'm really going to speak about is a relationship, kind of a second-order relationship, which is significant but not the big effect, and that is the relationship between employment fluctuations and workers' compensation injury frequency. Now, frequency is prorated. In this case, we're using BLS data, so it's going to be benchmarked to 10,000 FTEs, full employment units. So there's no clear reason a priori why this should vary when employment fluctuates, and yet it evidently does. And a standard hypothesis is basically that there's a positive relationship between employment fluctuations and workers' compensation injury frequency. Now, in simplest terms, and this is an intuitive way to think of it, employment up means frequency up, employment down means frequency down. Now, in more specific, precise terms, and I'm going to flip the slide and start showing you these in just a moment, but more specifically, I'm going to be talking about the relationship between year-on-year change in employment and year-on-year change in workers' comp injury frequency. I'm going to be correlating those things. So that means implicitly a correlation is going to be relative to a mean. Therefore, a positive relationship between these variables can exist even if frequency is always going down. The relationship can exist if frequency goes down more in years when employment is declining relative to trend and goes down less, doesn't necessarily have to increase, in a year where employment is growing more than trend. So let's go to the first slide. And this is going to address a question that, okay, fine, well and good. Are we really talking about recessions? And at first blush, it appears that we are. If you look at the chart here, the blue is employment change year on year. Green is injury frequency change. The first thing that grabs your attention is that there's a big dip down in blue and a spike in green around the Great Recession. Okay, so that looks pretty clear, and that's generally what attracts people's attention to the idea of a positive relationship. What's a little more intriguing is if you look at the correlation over the entire period, from 03 to 18, I believe it is, the overall correlation is essentially zero. 8% is pretty close to zero. So you see this pulse around the recession, but you don't see it outside of that. But now I'm going to show you an interesting and an intriguing, it's an empirical fact as to what it means and how we would explain it. We'll get to that in a moment. Let's lag, or rather lead these things. Notice these are contemporaneous. That's what the T indicates. If I simply, and it looked like the blue line just shifted left, because I'm correlating 1 year future change in employment with this year's frequency change. The correlation actually gets sharper, goes up to close to 60%. Now that's a more meaningful level of correlation. All right, this is for all sectors. What these are national numbers aggregated. Let's look at the different sectors and we'll take some favorites. A highly procyclical sector. Construction. Here's the same kind of relationship, contemporaneous T to T correlation. Again, you see this pulse, employment drops dramatically, frequency drops, and then it recovers. An interesting takeaway here, and a quick one, is that in construction, the recession evidently started earlier, closer to 07 or even 06, and the recovery lasted longer. So a theme, recession is not a fixed period of time. It can differ from industry to industry. And this is touching on the idea that it's not just recession, it's about industries. Let's do the same thing here. We've got, what, a 17% correlation? Let's do the lead. We go up to 44%, okay? So the correlation is more pronounced when we think of the current period injury frequency in terms of next period's employment change. How about manufacturing? What am I looking at? 28%? That looks pretty good, but it jumps up to 72% when I change when I lead employment. Let's look then at the idea that sectors are very different. Let's look at one which is not cyclical at all, which is education and health services. Here we get, with contemporaneous correlation, a relationship of minus 45%, which is not zero, but it's negative. And our standard hypothesis is that there's a positive relationship. So is this odd? Let's try the same thing. When we lead employment, our correlation drops to zero. Okay, so I'm going to suggest that this correlation hypothesis and a positive relationship exists much more strongly when we lead employment. And I'm going to wonder why that is. We don't see it in a sector like employment and health services. You do see the injury frequency spike, but notice that employment is flat. So it's just happening independently of employment movements. Okay, so we need to ask ourselves, this is an empirical fact, the data is there, whatever is driving it. We do have this kind of empirical relationship. So why might employment and injury frequency be related at all? John touched on some of the reasons. The first reason, and a leading theory from NCCI's perspective in terms of historical research particularly, is the idea that when employment goes down, you lose short-tenured workers. When it comes back up, you regain those short-tenured workers. That these have a higher frequency of injury than other workers, so it's this tenure mix. Okay, first to fire, first to rehire. That's one hypothesis. And indeed, some back-of-the-envelope calculations we did in the third quarter quarterly economics briefing suggests that we can explain about half of the frequency spike overall in the Great Recession from this phenomenon. Well, that's pretty good. That's half. On the other hand, that leaves the other half. And there's one paradox. The story about tenure doesn't work in terms of the one period leading employment change. Because by hypothesis, these people are affecting workers' comp frequency because they're laid off. If we're talking about next period's employment change, they haven't been laid off yet. So glaringly, this hypothesis doesn't work with that kind of a relationship. On the other hand, it may be contributing. There may be other stuff too. And John's other hypotheses do work better with the leading employment correlation hypothesis. And these are the idea that workers anticipating future layoffs are less likely to file a claim now, because once they're ready to report back to work, they don't want to find out that their job's gone, that they're the ones who got laid off. Conversely, if you're anticipating that employment is strong and growing, you may feel more comfortable with taking a claim now. And some claims are relatively discretionary. If you fall off a roof, that's not discretionary. But if you're dealing with a sore shoulder, with a sore back, you can think of yourself as an athlete, that, you know, I really need some treatment, but I can defer it. All right. So we've got those competing hypotheses. And what I would like to do in the next slide is to ask myself, can we get some kind of evidence that goes beyond these graphs that speaks to the idea that there really is a relationship, not just in general or with these general correlations, between next period's employment change and the current period rate of injury frequency. So let's do the following. And what this is going to do is to speak to the issue, is this all about recessions? Because in this chart, what we've got, and I'll explain what I'm doing here. This is state and sector data. So each data point in here is a specific state and a specific sector. And what we've done here is taken for each state and for each sector, and in each particular year, did employment increase in that sector in the following year? Okay, and what happened to the frequency, injury frequency? What was a change in injury frequency in the current year? So we've got all industries, we've got education and health services. Remember, that's the one that is relatively non-cyclical, and the two cyclical ones. Now, in general, with the exception of construction, if we've got, and here I'm looking at a case where employment increases in the next year. So I'm stratifying my sample in this way. And we're generally seeing that frequency is going down. Construction, it's basically flat. All right, now let's take all of the years for states and sectors in which, in the next year, employment in that state sector went down. What do we see? A rather dramatic increase. In aggregate, not so much in health and education services, although comparable to the whole, but quite marked in construction and manufacturing. All right? Now, we did the same thing. This is for all years of the data. It includes the recession. It includes the years before the recession. A question I'm frequently asked, and I'm very sympathetic to it, is that, well, we're living in the post-recession world. So let's look at the years after the recession. The economy is different now, after all. Same kind of exercise. Construction actually going up if in years when subsequent year employment increases in construction. All other industries going down. But, and this is from 2011 to 2017, we see the same kind of a relationship. Okay, so what this suggests is that notwithstanding that there is a short tenured worker effect that we believe we see, there's also evidence that there's other stuff going on as well that we've not tended to emphasize or to think of as much in the past as perhaps may be pertinent. So this suggests that there are different channels through which employment interacts with injury frequency. Different channels can mean that different recessions, depending on how they come about and what their nature is, may affect injury frequency differently. That's point one. Point two is one that I made earlier, which is simply that we speak in terms of recessions, but all of these stories, every single one of them, works at an industry level. In essence, what a recession is where all of the industries are experiencing similar effects, so they're singing in chorus, so to speak. So at an aggregated level, we see things more dramatically. But if you're concerned about frequency effects in a recession, you should also be cognizant that they can work at an industry level if that industry is undergoing a local fluctuation, a local recession, for example, a construction downturn, a manufacturing downturn, even if the rest of the economy in that region or in those years is not in a recession. So those are the 2 points I would like to leave you with, and I will turn the floor back to John.
I wasn't anticipating asking a question, but one of the things I was wondering is there another possible hypothesis for that T+1 employment effect, where maybe what's going on, even though it's employment in that next period, is that if temporary help workers are the ones that are laid off first, then you're going to get the layoff of the younger, less experienced workers in T+1, not in T. So that would be more coincident with when you see the actual injury, the decline in the injury rate among those who remain.
Sure. Should I speak from here or?
Either way,
Okay.
whatever you're comfortable.
Okay, thank you, Mike. There is that hypothesis. There's another hypothesis that I didn't mention, which is what I'll call the over-hours, under-hours hypothesis. That is to say, before most places hire new workers, their existing workforce is going to be working harder, is going to be working overtime, is going to have higher stress, higher pace of work. Okay, whereas in a downturn, before you lay people off, you wind up cutting their hours, which can have the same kind of effect. So the idea is simply suggestive of effects that I believe work outside of the traditional channel, which is simply people getting hired and fired in meaningful numbers, and there's a direct tenure effect because that suggests a contemporaneous correlation. Not to say that it's not there, but there are other effects potentially in play as well.
Yes, sir.
Hi, Joe Paduta. Question about the types of injuries. So if the assumption is that injuries that are more highly acute or more severe, like if you break a leg, then you break a leg and that's a work comp claim, as opposed to a sore shoulder, you can extend that care or not get care for a while. Is there an opportunity to look at the types of injuries pre and post a recession and pre and post to see if in fact we're seeing a decline in the number of those less acute or less severe injuries during the first part of that cycle that might speak to or that might help us understand if that's in fact happening? Does that make any sense as a question?
Yeah, it makes perfect sense. And I think the finding was intended to be indicative, somewhat provocative. It's certainly not, I mean, it's an empirical fact. And it may simply be aliasing things that I've not spoken about. However, it suggests a variety of hypotheses. It suggests that there would be a variety of further indicators along the lines of what you suggest, Joe. And it indicates that if we are going to do further research in this direction, then it'd be worthwhile to look at the nature of types of injuries, industry profiles. I thought there were some intriguing possibilities raised by the idea of new hires versus fires and how these balance out during, even within an industry, during a cyclical downturn and recovery that suggest a lot of further analytic detail, a lot of insight that might give us a better handle on what is the relationship between employment fluctuations and comp injury frequency.
So this is really helpful. I really thank you for this session. I think it's one of the more important set of facts or findings or assumptions that we're going to deal with going forward, because I think the impact of what's happening with the economy and specifically what's happening with frequency is going to end up driving a lot of strategic decisions on the part of payers, some in this room, a lot not, because if frequency continues to decline and if we see variations that we can pinpoint, it's going to really help payers, employers decide where they're going to invest money and what they're going to be looking at. So really appreciate the research.
Thanks, Joe. I was going to add also that the BLS data are very rich, and so I think your point is sort of suggested in the distinction between the fatal and the non-fatal data that I showed, where it was the impacts were much more apparent in the fatality data, and one can look at the BLS data by only looking at the most severe cases, those with 30 or more days away from work, for example, or by looking at it, as you suggested, by different natures of injury, looking at traumatic cases versus the soft tissue cases, as you will. And so I think that was a great suggestion for sort of further investigation.
Well, thank you very much for your questions, and thank you, Dr. Herk and Dr. Ruser. And please stay where you are. We're going to move right into our next session without a break. Thank you.